Welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. I'm actually this is the great much anticipated reunion in the flesh. I am with Pete Lee in the Nerve Centre in Santiago, Chile, where the essayist Roberto Merino called it the city where nothing ever happens. So our job is to bring you news from that place, and here we are. So Pete, our subject today.
Well, we really have to talk about the first year of the Boric government. Now, we're going to be talking about some things other than Chilean politics shortly, but we really have to get this one done because as of the end of March, the Boric government completed its first year of operation.
That's right. Just to what you said, we do want to do some shows at some point about things like the property market, because everybody's interested in sex and the property market, right? But for the moment, we're going to stick to this, fairly dry subject of Boric's first year in office, which is probably true to say, hasn't been a roaring success, right?
Yes, I mean, it depends on how you look at it. When the Boric government came in, there were some people with very high expectations for remarkable generational change. And there are other people with very low expectations because the personnel of the government didn't seem to be particularly experienced at government, or governing anyway. They had some time as functional politicians in most cases. But expectations were not especially high. I think to the point that in the early months of the government, and we did a show about after 70 days of the government, people had a perception of a general incompetence in the government, to the point that perception of incompetence was overriding any suspicion that corruption might be at play as well.
It never occurred to me particularly, that corruption might... I mean, obviously there's always some corruption, but... So you're saying that corruption has increased?
Well, I don't know about increased, but Boric, in his famous programme that he delivered in the process of running for president, made a point of denouncing pituto, that is to say, giving people jobs.
Because they're your friends or family. Nepotism.
And cronyism. And jobs for the boys and girls. And others. And this government, perhaps more than any other government, at least in living memory, does seem to be devoted to pituto. And that's, I think, been very damaging to the perception of the government. To be fair, no other aspects of Boric's program have really come to bear over the first year of government either. But that's been particularly disappointing, and there's been quite a bit of corruption, quite a bit of politically motivated decisions, such as the famous indultos,
the pardons for people who committed crimes during the great insurrection, as they call it, the rioting.
Yes, without due diligence done on some of
the
decisions.
It's been so long since we've done a live, sort of transmission that I think we've both forgotten whether we're supposed to look at the camera or at each other. So do forgive any kind of amateurism. Well, I think
we're generally forgiven for our production values on Chile Talk.
That's right. I think I will mainly look at the camera. So disappointing even on this limited, because I mean Chile has been quite strict about nepotism. They try to be, haven't they? I know, for example, at the state university, this is something that's strayed across my orbit, the University of Chile. People applying to do a degree in art used to have to do a test to show that they actually had some artistic ability, and that was abolished. As far as I can understand, purely on the grounds that it was not a sufficiently objective test. And the only objective test is the school leaving exam, which is a multiple choice test, and therefore marked by a computer. And there is a lot of this. There is this effort. One might feel carried too far in certain directions to make things objective and incorruptible. But this is not advancing at the moment.
No. So now, rather than the government simply being seen as incompetent, it's seen to be corrupt as well, and that's sunk in. So people are upset about that. Now, Chilean populism has responded in a peculiar way, especially given that, relatively speaking, Boric did harness.
I thought he was Chilean populism.
Yeah. He was one part of Chilean populism because his opponent in the runoff of the presidential election also had a populist kind of Bolsonaro adjacent approach, Juan Antonio Cast. So we had the sort of right populism against the kind of left populism, the left aesthetic.
That's right.
But during the last year, the populism has turned so decidedly, I guess, in a rightward direction, if we can entertain that, to the point that one of the marquee pieces of legislation currently making its way through the system concerns the right of policemen to use force when threatened violently, which is a very strong message. But this strong message is basically saying the law has to support the police such that the police can do their job, because we're worried about the perception of crime and actual crime. So we've seen this swing from it being quite fashionable and certainly apparently acceptable to say kill the pacos, kill the policemen, to now no, the police need a special provision to protect them in doing their work.
Now, I mean, you know the ins and outs of the stuff more than me. I mean, I believe this is what happens in all countries, which is that, of course, the police can already use force if threatened with violence. Any individual citizen can. So it's the kind of thing like, it's kind of responding to a public mood. It's like there are already about 20 laws allowing the police to use force. Let's make another law saying even more emphatically that the police can use force when threatened with violence, right? It's not that they couldn't before.
No, although, of course, Chile is so invested in the human rights discourse, and has been increasingly so since the 1960s, that there may be problems with the wording of the legislation.
Which has not been supported by the Communist Party?
Yeah, the Communist Party is certainly against it, and the Frente Amplio movement knows that it's damaging to their particular populist aesthetic. The Chilean Communist Party's populist aesthetic is particularly righteous and peculiar and not very popular.
Not very popular. It's one of those slightly cerebral leftovers,
yes.
from the 1930s.
Yes. Whereas Frente Amplio does have a vocation to be popular, at least with younger people, and doesn't seem to be as popular as it was. So it's the popular move at the moment, and the populist move seems to be this rampant change in direction in terms of public support for the police.
That's right. Now, for certain, there has been, I believe it's true to say, I mean, I think everybody feels this, and I think statistics confirm it, there has been a large increase in crime. This does seem to be strongly linked to immigration, which is something that respectable people, of course, here, as in the rest of the Western world, don't like to mention. People, I think it's true to say, a lot of people strongly dislike immigrants from Colombia, places like Venezuela, who just play music loud. I mean, not because they're necessarily criminals, because they sort of play music loudly and the Chilean tends to like to kind of skulk about a bit and sort of not look people in the eye too much, And there's a different culture being brought in by this immigration, and there for sure is gang crime, and drug-related gang crime on quite a large scale. Stuff that you did not used to see in Chile, executions, kidnappings, stuff that was really exotic before, just 5 years ago was exotic, and that's becoming quite normal, And that, of course, is a big driver of what we would call right-wing populism. So why the right wing should have a monopoly on law and order is another question for another day.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's but it's to the extent that in the upcoming election for the members, the councillors of who will write the new constitution, along with experts,
Which is coming up pretty soon now, isn't it? When is that?
It's in May, May the 7th, I believe, is the election. The traditional right or centre-right bloc, Chile Vamos, is calling itself Chile Seguro, secure Chile, for the purposes of that election.
I'm sure that they will be as helpless as everybody else to actually do anything about it. But they make the right noises, don't they? So that's clearly something that's driving things to the right. And I don't know, it's always been my impression. I remember telling my wife, who's Argentinian, the Chileans are not revolutionaries, they're all kind of pretty right-wing, really deep down. And then, of course, you had all these great big protests, a couple of years ago, and this left-wing government swept into power. Just, you see, kind of totally misread the country. So I'm always trying to vindicate myself, So I like to see this as a return. I like to see the election of the Boric government as the kind of last kick of this kind of ludic, playful Chile that came into being as a reaction to the dictatorship. People queuing up to be photographed naked by that American photographer, what's his name?
Yes.
Stanley Kubrick?
Spencer
Tunick, that's right. People queuing up. Tunick, I've said this before, but Tunick said he'd never experienced a reaction to his work like in Chile. People just like falling over themselves to get naked and running around like screaming like children at a birthday party. There was this big sort of ludic thing, which was a big contrast to the sort of glum faces people had before. And maybe it's just now, maybe this was the last kick, was electing Boric.
Another way to look at it is the vinegar strokes of the protracted adolescence of this new generation of basically of the Chilean ruling class that's been ruling the place for many thousands of years, essentially.
So much longer than the country's actually existed.
Yes. And certainly during the Republican period, we call the liberalising younger movement the Pipiolos, the Pissers, and the older.
So we're talking the 19th century now.
Yes, we're talking about the 1820s, and their opponents, the more experienced bigwigs, the Pelucones. We have this dynamic throughout Chilean history forever, and it would seem that the Frente Amplio movement is another Pipiolo movement, which is always my analysis.
Right.
And I'm always right, aren't I?
Well, I think we're both always right. This is why we watch this show. So, how much events might seem to move against this? It all comes out right in the end.
Although, one thing I must say about the expectations is now that the expectations have shifted from this kind of ambiguous goodwill and low expectations to low expectations per se, and I'm not sure that isn't a good thing for the government. With the few changes that the government was able to effect in terms of Boric's cabinet, just in time for the anniversary of the government, one of the things below the cabinet level, largely, although some of the ministers that have come in look better than the ones that have replaced, they haven't been able to replace other ones simply because they couldn't find someone to replace people who aren't well suited to their job. At the lower political appointment levels, some of the people do seem to be possibly more capable technocrats than were in play in the first year. That said, the Boric government has gone on a hiring spree in the public service and employed, I believe, 80,000 new civil servants of various levels and with various levels of political appointment.
At quite high salaries.
At quite high salaries in many cases, at a time that the economy probably can't afford that. Some of the higher level people who have come in do seem a bit more capable. Not all. So expectations are low.
That's right. And as you say, the economy can't afford it, but the economy can afford. I mean, the government can Chile's got a very low public debt, and actually, I think the budget was in surplus. I mean, there was a complete turnaround after COVID, and really fiscally, Chile has actually been extremely sound.
It's up to 40 or 50% now of GDP, I think, which is
that might be
getting higher.
That might be the gross figure, but I think Chile's got a lot of investments abroad. I think the net figure was Chile was actually in credit just a very few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I don't think I'd have to check, but the fiscal position is pretty good, very good compared to most Western countries.
Yes.
This is the other thing: a left-wing government could go on a borrowing-fueled spending spree, to use the classic phrase, which I had trouble pronouncing, a borrowing-fueled spending spree, which they kind of haven't done. And that seems such an obvious, thing to have recourse to, that perhaps we should be looking out for it. But there does seem to be this culture of fiscal soundness that politicians are deeply infected with, even on the left.
Yes, I think this year, hopefully, inflation gets down to a single figure, single digit.
But we're seeing second round effects. Pay settlements that are at least inflation, so but not huge productivity gains anywhere. So it's not obvious how it's going to come down quickly.
A lot of us, I think, were hoping, were wanting to believe that inflation could go down to perhaps 5% or 6% this year, which would be more or less in line. The Chilean inflation typically sits at about 4% rather than the 2% that the very wealthiest countries seem to aim for. I think a lot of us wanted to believe that it could get down to within touching distance of that. If that doesn't happen, well, it's going to be an uncomfortable winter for a lot of people.
That's right. And something we mustn't detain you too long, but we were just commenting for the show, the great lack of industrial unrest, strikes. You're seeing now Europe, France, Germany, Britain, whatever. People going out on strike. We're not seeing that here. Obviously, as you were saying, partly because the unions are supportive of the government. But who knows? Things could get tricky.
Yes. It's been a tough year for the Boric government. It's been a tough year for Chile, and hopefully this next year will be better. But so far, we can't see how.
We shall see. Okay. Anyway, thank you for joining us. I should just mention that we were going to record this on some slightly more sophisticated equipment, which didn't work, so it's being recorded on a phone. So I'm now going to reach out and press the stop button. See you next time on Chile Talk.
Ciao.